Does that mean that they clearly have that feeling that Brussels is not accountable enough to national governments and to voters? So how, I think what we're going to talk about is how to try and sort of make sort of like establish a model, I guess, where voters feel like they've got more of a say and their own governments have more of a say. The other things are obviously some MPs want Parliament to vote on both the negotiation and the deal that the government will get with the EU and from the EU. And so I think we're going to talk about, are they right to want that? Should they, should Parliament have a say, or should even voters have a say? Should Theresa May go to the country about it? Yes, to talk about it. Welcoming Stephen Booth, the co-director of think tank Open Europe. Vernon, Bogdanor, who is the research professor at the Institute for Contemporary British History at King's College London. Former Shadow Europe Minister Emma Reynolds, Labour MP. Douglas Carswell, the UKIP Parliamentary Party. Former Attorney General Dominic Grieve. So they'll make statements and then we'll open up to the floor. Who wants to start?
I'm going to stand up so you can see me at the back. My name's Emma Reynolds. I'm a Labour MP. By way of introduction, I campaign to remain in the European Union, but I accept the result of the referendum. I'm not a Ramona. I'm not somebody who thinks we should have a second referendum. I think the priority now must be to get the best deal for the UK. Now, people voted Brexit for many different reasons. So the sort of tautology that we've heard from the government that Brexit means Brexit is pretty useless in my view, and I'll come on to it very briefly in a minute about why I think Parliament should have a say on the terms of the negotiations in a way to be constructive, not to block the triggering of Article 50. Now, sovereignty was not one of the many reasons people voted to leave, as was a sense of nostalgia about the 1950s and 1960s that somehow prior to us joining the EU or prior to the rise of globalisation, people had more control over their lives, more control over the economy, and the economy worked for them. So sovereignty wasn't the only reason, it was connected to many of the other reasons, and obviously immigration was too. And we have to concede as Remainers, or post-Remainers, that the mantra of the Leave campaign about taking back control did resonate with people. But often I think the discussion about sovereignty is polarised. And I'm going to quote a Tory, actually, Dominic, if you don't mind. Geoffrey Howe once said, "Sovereignty is not like virginity, which you either have or you don't have." And I think by that he meant there's a spectrum. And actually, I think what's interesting about this debate, and what's interesting in the context of an interdependent, globalised world where we want to trade with other countries, whether you're in the single market or whether you're Norway in the European Economic Area, or whether you're Canada who's desperate to not let Wallonia get in the way, or you have a free trade deal with the rest of the EU, or whether you're in the WTO, all of these frameworks involve some pooling of sovereignty. Obviously some more than others. And perhaps the irony is that the more you are willing to pool, the better your access and the better the terms of the trade. And the single market is an example of that. But it wasn't an argument that we were able to win in the referendum campaign, because we pool more sovereignty when we accept at the moment ECJ judgments. We accept that we are going to sometimes disagree with our European partners, but we have QMV rather than unanimity in many, in single market areas and some others. But we accept that in return for that, we get unfettered access for our businesses and our products and our services sometimes in that market. So we shouldn't see it as an absolute, I think it's a spectrum, and there are trade-offs. So if, as the Prime Minister seems to be going in the direction of not being in the single market, not being a member of the single market, there will clearly be trade-offs with regard to our access to the single market. Now, I just want to say something about what I think the government should be doing, rather than what we're seeing at the moment. I think actually the government should be trying to create goodwill amongst the EU 27 that all have their own national politics, that are all worried above all about the well-being and continuation of the EU, political considerations often put above economic considerations. And if you listen to some of the rhetoric from some of the hardest Brexiteers, they say, they need us more than we need them. And actually, I think that misunderstands quite fundamentally what the parameters of this debate are, and they are more political than economic. I think they are willing to take a short-term economic hit, not to suffer the political price of possibly the National Front or others, extreme parties in other member states who are quite strong, calling for a similar referendum in their own countries, or calling for different types of reform of the EU that they don't want. So I think we should be, we should have in our minds that this negotiation is as political, perhaps more political than it is economic. Very briefly, on the question that you posed about whether MPs should have a say, my view is that MPs should have a say, because I don't think that the mandate that we have received, I think we are leaving the EU, we will leave the EU, but there are so many different forms that exit could take. And what I want to do is make sure that we take into account what people have said to us during that referendum, but that in the words of the Chancellor, that we don't sign off on anything that makes us poorer. And I'm afraid, apart from the Chancellor, the other cabinet ministers that have been sounding up about this seem to think that it's for ideological reasons worth making us poorer to get the ideological things that they want. And that's why I think Parliament, which represents every corner of the country, should have a say on the terms of the deal, and definitely should have a say on the terms and the outline of the negotiation strategy, because after all, the European Parliament are going to get this, and other member states are going to get the opening position, and therefore I think we should be in a position to scrutinise that and constructively have an input into that before the trigger. Not to block the trigger, I'm not a Ramona. I think this is an absurd straw man. There are some MPs in that position, but they're in a minority. And I'm afraid the Eurosceptics use this far too often. I'm not one of those. I want the best possible deal for the EU, but this is a complex negotiation, and there'll be many trade-offs, and we have to level with people like that. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, like Emma, I voted Remain in the referendum, which I think was a great democratic event which reveals a crisis in our democratic system. It was an extraordinary democratic event because of the huge popular commitment in voting, 72%, the highest turnout since the general election of 1992, and turnout highest in the Leave areas. Four lowest turnout areas included the three Remain areas, which were Northern Ireland, London and Scotland. Scotland had the second lowest turnout in the whole country. They, oddly enough, were the regions which called for a second referendum immediately after June the 23rd. The referendum seems to me the most important political event in this country since 1945, because it's an unexpected grassroots rebellion against the British political establishment, against all three major parties. In fact, all thought that Britain should remain in the European Union. It was clear in the case of the government that it was repudiated, and David Cameron resigned. These sorts of revolts are very rare in British politics. The last one I can think of was as long ago as 1922, when the Lloyd George coalition was overthrown against the establishment then. But it wasn't just David Cameron that was repudiated, but also the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats parties, if you like, of the left. Because although the majority of Labour voters did support Remain, no fewer than apparently 37% voted Leave. And one of the things they were complaining about, I think, was the Labour Party's attitude on immigration. Now, many of the Leave voters, some of the Leave voters were accused afterwards of bigotry, of racism and dislike of Poles and so on. It's true, there were some incidents against Poles and very regrettable attacks. But if you're looking for racism and bigotry in British politics, sadly it comes from the left of the Labour Party and university students in the form of anti-Semitism, which is much more widespread than attacks on Poles, and much more serious problem, I think, in British politics. Now, the problem with European Party is a problem of democracy, and it was first raised many years ago, oddly enough, by a leader of the Labour Party, who never became Prime Minister, Hugh Gateskill, who in a speech at the Labour Party conference in 1962 criticised the European Commission, which he said had powers but is not responsible or under anyone's control. And he said the response from Europeans was that we should set up a federal assembly with powers over the commissioners. But that Gateskill went on to say, in very famous words, meant that powers are taken from national governments and handed over to federal parliaments. And then he said that would be the end of 1,000 years of history. Well, whether you agree with that or not, it's clear that it's no longer plausible that such powers will be handed away from national parliaments, even in the countries which remain in the European Union. Now, I said this was the most important political event since 1945, but at a recent seminar in King's College London, a colleague of mine, Professor Tredimus, said he thought it was the most important constitutional event since 1660. And he said that because it introduced a new principle into the Constitution, the principle of the sovereignty of the people, which is trumping the sovereignty of the Parliament. And the House of Commons, for I think the first time in its history, is compelled to follow a major policy which the majority of its members do not agree with. So the sovereignty of Parliament, which the Brexiteers wanted to recover, is now constrained not by Brussels but by the people. And the whole argument, in the sense between government and Parliament in Article 50, is in a sense a very minor one, because the key constraint on the government is not Parliament but the people. And my suspicion is, and this isn't my view, but it's, I suspect the majority view, that the people will insist on a restriction on immigration from the European Union. And I take the view that if it wasn't for the immigration from Central Europe, that the European Union would not have become so emotive an issue that a referendum was necessary. Now, Emma said that, she quoted Geoffrey Howe saying that sovereignty is not like virginity. Well, I think national sovereignty is not like virginity, but I think parliamentary sovereignty is. Either Parliament has the legal power to control EU immigration or it doesn't. That is, I think, a binary choice. Now, what's clear is the referendum has exposed how unrepresentative Parliament is, and it's also, I think, exposed the issue of the electoral system again, because one of the reasons that turnout was so high in so many very strong Labour areas was that people's votes actually counted. I mean, if you live in Sunderland or Hartlepool, your vote doesn't count in a safe seat, and the parties campaign in the areas of marginal seats. And general elections, the important people are those living in marginals. Here, every vote actually counts, and I think that's one reason for the high turnout. And therefore, I think this gives greater pressure for proportional representation, which would also help the moderate left, because the vast majority of Labour MPs, and dare I say this includes Emma, have much more in common with Liberal Democrats than they do with people on their left. And in my opinion, the majority of Labour MPs have crossed the Rubicon, because having passed a motion of no confidence in Jeremy Corbyn, they now cannot appeal to the voters in a general election to vote for a Labour government led by Jeremy Corbyn. So the referendum was a defeat for the moderate right and also for the left in British politics. But if the left draws lessons from it, the defeat can be turned into opportunity. And I think I do want to conclude on this point by saying I think the referendum is a striking illustration of democratic commitment on the part of the least fortunate in this country. Because the greatest threat to democracy is an inert electorate. And the people who turned out to vote are those who have very few resources other than the vote. Most of us don't need the vote. We're articulate. We can make our views heard. We're talking about the least fortunate. And John Stuart Mill once famously said, you don't learn to swim or cycle by reading books about it, but by swimming and cycling. And so you don't learn about democracy by reading books, but by participating and making decisions about democracy. Now, I just want to conclude with a couple of remarks about the European Union, because I think I said this is a reflection of crisis in democracy in Britain, but I also think it reflects a crisis in the European Union, because it's a paradox in a sense that we're leaving Europe when it's moving in, as it were, a British direction that is becoming more intergovernmental. And it may be that British Brexit speeds up that process and acts as a wake-up call in the European Union. And indeed, Donald Tusk has said that the EU needs to take a long, hard look at itself and listen to the British warning signal. He said that before the referendum. I think it's even more true now, that it's moving into an intergovernmental direction, because you have to raise the question of whether a transnational organisation of 28 states with very different cultures and languages can actually be democratic, or whether democracy isn't best secured through the member states. And the European Union is moving towards what de Gaulle famously called our Europe des Patries, as an intergovernmental organisation, but with this difference that the members think not only of their own countries, of their own interests, but also that of Europe as a whole. And I think the continent has suffered in the past of not having that perspective, 1914 being a very obvious example. And I think the European Union therefore must face reality that we're moving towards what Liberal Democrat MEP Andrew Duff has called never closer union. We're not moving in a supranational direction. And if it takes that lesson to heart, it's still possible that Britain may remain in the European Union, in my opinion, because our contribution was always to say that rhetoric should be subordinated to reality. And that's what the European project now leads if it's to prosper. And if the European Union listens to what the people are saying, the way the British government is listening to what the people are saying, it might be possible to persuade the British people to have second thoughts in another referendum. I don't wholly exclude it. Thank you.
Good evening. There are many things that Emma said that I find myself agreeing with. I particularly agreed with her when she talked about the need for goodwill. The last thing we want to see is British politicians, particularly some of our MEPs, slightly sort of swaggering and making slightly sort of gloating speeches in the European Parliament. We need to recognise that we need to get on very well with our neighbours and friends across the Channel after we've left. The question really is how do we do that now that we're going to leave? One area where I disagree with Emma is this idea that somehow voting to leave was somehow an expression of nostalgia, a backward-looking movement. If us Eurosceptics were backward-looking reactionaries, we would have fizzled and faded away over the years, whereas in fact Euroscepticism has grown in strength. I would say the reason why many of us Eurosceptics are Eurosceptics is precisely because we see the European Union as the outdated mid-1950s construct. It's a creation from a time when tower blocks were felt to be futuristic and modern. Leaving the European Union is, I believe, a way for us to thrive and prosper in the 21st century and to be more competitive and more successful. As someone who spent all their adult life campaigning against Britain's EU membership, I'd be the first to recognise that the result was actually pretty close. And I think it's important to recognise that and acknowledge that doesn't give carte blanche check to anyone to try to define what happens next. I've spent 25 years banging on about Europe, and I don't really want to spend the next 25 years banging on about Europe. I think we need to try to create a new national consensus and to appeal to reasonable people on the Remain side and try to come to an arrangement that works for everyone. I say that, but sometimes when I say that, it's a little difficult when the response comes back that somehow the referendum result is illegitimate and, as the good professor implied, needs to be overturned. I'm slightly surprised that I'm pleased you don't want to overturn the referendum. What does leave mean? It's pretty simple. No European Union court or legislature should have jurisdiction over the United Kingdom. That's a fairly straightforward definition of what it means to leave. All this debate about the single market and whether we should be in it, with respect to Nick Clegg and co, it's blindingly obvious that we should leave the single market, because if we remain in the single market, we would continue to be subject to the jurisdiction of European EU institutions and courts and legislatures. It was why, consistently during the referendum, Vote Leave campaigners made it clear that we meant leaving the single market. Indeed, we were criticised at the time for saying that we needed to leave the single market. Having said that, we will continue to need to cooperate with the EU, and there are many things we currently do in terms of cooperation with the EU, which I think we could continue to do very successfully under bilateral treaty arrangements. There may well be a case for continuing to have cooperation in the field of criminal justice. There may well be the need for cooperation when it comes to managing fish stocks in the North Sea, but all of those things can be done at a bilateral level and through treaties rather than through the institutions, supranational institutions in Brussels. When it comes to the free movement of people, look, before we joined the EU, it was perfectly possible for a business in this country to hire someone from France or Germany, and long should that continue. We want to end the unrestricted free movement of people, but I'm sure that a deal can be done on the free movement of workers. That is perfectly doable and perfectly feasible. I said several times during the campaign, as did Boris Johnson and Michael Gove and Visa Stewart, we're not talking about closing Britain's borders. We want to be able to control Britain's borders. There's a world of difference between the two. Should there be a debate in the House of Commons? I love it when there are debates on Europe in the House of Commons. I try to prompt lots of debates and votes on matters European in the House of Commons. But I think people need to understand that once Article 50 has been triggered, and I'm assuming the judiciary doesn't try to thwart and subvert the process, assuming Article 50 has been triggered, it means that in 24 months' time, regardless of what arrangements we've entered into with the EU, we are no longer members of the EU. So to suggest that we should have a second referendum or that somehow Parliament should vote on the content of that agreement, it's all very well, but it's not ultimately going to stop the fact that 24 months after invoking Article 50, we're out, we've left. If I may, I would just sort of draw my conclusions, my thoughts to an end. Parliamentary sovereignty is, I always understood it, shorthand for sovereignty of the people. I've been campaigning for many years to ensure that the legislature is better able to scrutinise the executive, and I'm glad that that cause has now found a number of new advocates who suddenly have woken up to the idea of parliamentary oversight of government. But let's not, please, make the mistake of believing that somehow this can be used as a tool to thwart the outcome of the referendum. Parliamentary sovereignty is shorthand for sovereignty of the people. Ultimately, I suppose if Parliament does play silly games and ministers are flat-footed enough to be caught out by this, there will be an election if Parliament was successful in trying to prevent Article 50 being triggered. And I suspect that one or two MPs currently in the House of Commons may not be in the House of Commons after that election. Finally, a lot of emphasis has been put on how, after we've left the European Union, relations between Britain and the EU will change. Here's a thought. I suspect that in 5, 10, 15 years, if we were to have this conversation here in post-Europa House, we would be pleasantly surprised at the extent to which many things about British EU cooperation haven't changed. There will continue to be Erasmus exchanges, there will continue to be the things that we want to see continue. The real change that's going to come, I think, is between Britain's relations with the rest of the world. That, I think, really will change, and already we're starting to see some big shifts. Once Britain is able to strike trade deals with the rest of the world, I think it will profoundly change many of the parameters, and I think it will have a profoundly positive impact upon our per capita GDP. Thank you very much.
Well, I can see, listening to Douglas Carswell, why he ceased to be a Conservative. He clearly, Douglas, you've read Dicey, but if you have, you're certainly not in agreement with the Dicey view of our national constitution. Because, correct, he says, because whilst it's quite clear that ultimately there is a sense of sovereignty lying with the people, the expression of that sovereignty is through representative democracy. And that means that ultimately, unless you wish to have a revolution, it is for Parliament to be both the guardian of the democracy and to represent the democratic will through its votes. Now, there's no doubt that we have an extraordinary crisis in our country. Historically, we've been rather good at marrying the concept of parliamentary sovereignty with the fact that we are probably the greatest treaty-making power in world history and have always been willing to pool sovereignty in national self-interest. We've been doing it for years. I think we're signed up to some 13,000 treaties signed since 1834. Over 700 of them have got mechanisms to arbitrate disputes which we engage to be bound by the outcome of that arbitration. The only difference between that and, in fact, our European Union commitments is the doctrine on principle of direct effect, which is a significant issue, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But we've managed it. Well, we certainly managed it until the referendum earlier this year, when that collapsed completely. My personal view is that the collapse marked a huge crisis and democratic deficit in the way in which we carry out our affairs. There are a number of explanations that can be given for it, and I don't claim that my own are comprehensive, but it seems to me that for quite a long period in the run-up to the referendum, on issues which didn't just concern the European Union, there has been a marked growth in a form of presentational politics which avoids difficult issues and where politicians massage their messaging in order simply to gain votes. And that process broke down. You could see it particularly with the issue of immigration. My Remain colleagues, despite my efforts at persuading them to do so, were completely unable or unwilling to engage with that issue during the course of the referendum campaign. They explained to me that the focus group experts they had told us that we shouldn't talk about it because it was playing into the hands of the Brexiters, and in the circumstances we should just concentrate on economic issues. It was plain to me that that was wrong, and also that it wouldn't work. But of course it was almost inevitable, because for the previous 15 years politicians have been entirely unwilling to talk about immigration, except in terms of sound bites and the promises that it would come down next year. And each time we failed to deliver on it. So, in my view, Remainers have only themselves to blame for the failure of the referendum campaign, because as a Remainer, it seemed to me that we were unwilling to go out and make challenging assertions about what we thought was in the best interests of our own country. I also have some serious criticisms of the way in which the Brexiters behaved themselves, including telling the most astonishing lies during the course of the campaign. But then again, if you allow the democratic framework in which you carry out your discourse to deteriorate to the extent that we have allowed it to happen over the last 20 years, you shouldn't be surprised that that happens, and you shouldn't be surprised that you have no means of adequately challenging it when it does. It's a problem which is affecting the whole of the Western world, and is also, and particularly North America at the moment, as we can see, as well as many of our European partners. So where do we go from here? Well, as a traditionalist conservative, the first point I start at is that this is a wake-up call about the role of Parliament. And so for that reason I disagree totally with Douglas about the role of Parliament in the Brexit process. No government can carry out the Brexit process successfully unless it can take Parliament with it. And I myself am not prepared to be browbeaten by anybody into abandoning my duty in scrutinising legislation and in trying to ensure that the outcome is one which is in the national interest. And the reason why in the last 2 to 3 weeks we've had some quite intense debate was because of the sense amongst myself and fellow parliamentarians that what we were actually seeing was a closing down of options, invoking a popular will, which I have to say, Douglas, simply cannot be gleaned in its detail from the referendum vote itself. I participated in debates in my constituency where people perfectly properly were advocating Brexit and advocating totally different models of Brexit as to what they themselves wanted from it. And whilst I'm entirely respectful of the decision of the electorate, and it is the duty of government and Parliament to implement it, the first thing we have to do is to have a proper debate, the very thing we've never had, in order to ascertain what the pros and cons of the different options are. And if we have that debate, and we're beginning to have it, I think we will find it very good, therapeutic for bringing people together, good for people understanding what the issues are, and good also for expressing to our continental partners, the EU, what it is that the United Kingdom is trying to achieve. So I see that as the single most important thing. The EU has never been a democratic institution. Here Douglas and I would agree. I do not consider that the European Parliament has ever had, I'm afraid, any democratic legitimacy whatsoever. It's a very valuable body for scrutinising the activities of the Commission, but it does not have democratic legitimacy. And one of the problems is that the development of the European Union has failed to have had regard to the role of nation states and national parliaments, has given power to the Commission and the Parliament, removed it from the Council of Ministers where treaty-making decisions accountable to national parliaments should be made, and it's necessary, I think, when we go forward, for us to look very carefully that future relationships have to have regard to that basic lesson. As to where we go in building a new relationship, I'm entirely open-minded. I happen to believe that the closer the relationship is, the better it will be for all of us. And that's what I myself will strive to do, but we need to have that debate. I have to say the starting point for that debate is just over the road at Westminster. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to background, Open Europe was neutral in a referendum campaign, and we're not to be confused with Open Britain, which is also a different thing. I'm going to say three things, I think. The first one of which is what I think the logic of the referendum result is, and here I think I agree with Douglas. I think it's quite clear what the parameters actually are of this, in the sense that the British public clearly voted for an arm's length political relationship with the European Union. And that means leaving the customs union, and it probably means leaving the single market, because it makes very little sense to say we've given up our influence in the institutions to then bind ourselves very closely economically and have no say. It completely undermines the actual Remain argument that was made in the campaign. It was a perfectly legitimate argument to say we should stay in the EU in order to influence it. But to say we're going to stay in all the apparatus of, or the output of the EU without influence, to me, is illogical. And it has real consequences, not just in terms of democratic accountability, but also in terms of the new relationships the UK might build outside of the EU and beyond Europe. Because we're in the customs union, it's ready through a trade agreement with any other entity. And in an increasing world of complex trade agreements, where actually you're not just talking about reducing tariffs, you're talking about harmonising regulations. How are we going to go and talk to the US about harmonising regulations if we've agreed to an EU standard of which we have no influence over? So I think the logic of this is actually very clear. So I think we've had that argument. That was the referendum campaign. So what I think we have to think about now is, well, what are the implications of this, and how do we end up with a positive relationship with the EU and a positive European role for the UK? The first question is answering that very point. Does the UK want to remain a European player? Because that isn't entirely clear from the statements that are coming from the government in terms of how we say we've left the EU, haven't left Europe. Well, I think the rest of the EU is entitled to ask, well, that's great, but how do you intend to remain a European player? In concrete terms, what are you going to do to maintain your influence over what happens in Europe and play a constructive role? The only people who can answer that is the UK government, and we have to think about how we can do that. And I think actually here there are lots of things we can do. We are the biggest defence player in the EU, we're the biggest aid donor in the EU. We play a huge role in the European internal security, external security. There are lots of things that we can actually talk positively about in European terms. And I also agree with Douglas on the point here that actually divorced from all the trade-offs involved in EU membership, perhaps the UK might actually be more engaged in some of these things. If we don't feel that everything we say yes to in 5 or 10 years might lead to something else that we didn't read the small print, if it's actually an intergovernmental negotiation, perhaps the UK government will actually be more free to actually engage positively and constructively in some of the things where we've been traditionally very much on the back foot because we didn't want to say yes in case, well, who knows what this means in 5 to 10 years' time. But I think the onus here is on the UK. We can't simply say, and I agree with Emma, this is not just a business deal, this is a political negotiation. And we're dealing with a political body. I think, again, we've completely underestimated what's going on in terms of European politics. The biggest trade relationship is with Germany. So surely Germany wants a trade deal with us. Well, I think that's true to a certain extent. If you talk to businesses, that's true. But Germany was also the keenest that we stay in for very political reasons, and they saw us as a useful ally, and they're going to be the most emotionally hurt by the fact we've left. So there's a tension here between what some of the political interests might be and what the business relationship would sort of tell you logically should be the case. And I think what the UK does need to do is say start from the top down and actually say, and I think the problem here is that anchoring this in democratic foundation, which is the title of the discussion, is very difficult because we haven't had a proper discussion about what Britain's role is in the world. The campaign was very poor on all of those things. I don't think anyone really understands what the UK's foreign policy is. Vis-a-vis Europe, vis-a-vis any other region in the world, what are we actually trying to achieve? I mean, this is the kind of strategic thinking that has to be done, and it should be done in Parliament. But without that kind of in our heads, it's very difficult to go and talk about how much trade can we have to control immigration. I mean, this is going to be the crux of the negotiation, but it's actually a subset of a much bigger discussion, which is what kind of country do we want to be in, what kind of relationship does that entail with our European partners. So I think starting from the top and then working our way down is actually the best way of achieving the best relationship with Europe. And I think actually if we can achieve a broad agreement with the EU about the end destination, actually some of the knotty issues around trade, free movement of people actually become much less contentious and much easier to resolve if it's clear that we are working in terms of the mutual interest and to a sort of a vaguely agreed end destination. At the moment we have none of that, and you can see why positions on both sides of the channel are hardening as a result. But just sort of one word of pessimism, I guess, to finish off, is that I think the really big question right now is there the sort of political flexibility required for that kind of strategic and creative thinking? Does that exist on either side of the channel? The UK government does feel quite boxed in, but even more so when you look across the channel, when you look at what's happening in the European Union as a whole. I mean, we might have faced the problem of there being far too much democratic accountability in the EU, in the sense that the Canadian trade deal has been held up by the Walloon Parliament. And I think that the political pressure that individual leaders feel themselves under, we've got a Dutch election, a German election, a French election, whether all these constraints enable the kind of creative thinking that I think is required to come up with a new bespoke UK-EU relationship, because we're not going to have the Norway deal, we're not going to have the Swiss deal, it has to be something different. But whether we can have that creative thinking, I'm not so sure, and I think that's why the UK is, I think, be bold and ambitious in putting a good offer forward and actually trying to change the terms of the debate. Because if we just discuss the 4 freedoms of the single market and we just talk to the institutions, I don't see how that negotiation goes any better than the last time we tried that with David Cameron. We have to change the discussion, and I think that means broadening the terms of the debate, bringing in issues of foreign policy, security, and a much wider strategic relationship between the